All right, a lot of light. So good evening to everyone. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Excellency Cluster Scripps, although I can't see anyone in the slide. My name is Andreas Eckert. I'm a historian of Africa at Humboldt University and one of the many PIs, principal investigators of this Excellency Cluster. I'm here also on behalf of one of our bosses, Tanja Börzel, political scientist at Free University, who for health reasons unfortunately can't make it. And unfortunately there's also another person who can't make it tonight, fortunately not Aaron, he's here, but Philipp Stab, who was supposed to be the discussant, had to opt out in the very last minute for health reasons as well. We might interpret it as a contestation of the liberal script, but I think it's just the current situation. So this is the fourth and for this year last event within this conversation series featuring the liberal script, which means to, or has, the idea is to provide an opportunity for members of this cluster to present their recent work, usually monographs and books. So we had a series of speakers like Christoph Möllers, Michael Zörn, Stefan Mau, and now Aaron, a rather male group if I think about it, but the next series will hopefully change that. So what is Scripps? I mean, to explain what an excellency cluster is a very difficult task. The simplest way would be it's a huge agglomeration of researchers, here, in this case, here based in Berlin in different universities and research institutions, and they share one broad interest, that is to analyze why the liberal script is contested, what kind of political, economic, cultural, and social problems are around, and what kind of solutions might be there, but also mainly to explain why these contestations came about, how old they are, how they changed over time. So in short, it's the effort or the attempt to explain what is going on in the global order and to explain it both historically, contemporary, but also to think about what kind of recipes might be around for the future. And futuring the liberal script, so this series of events is not a kind of naive debate about how the world could be better, but to critically engage with a number of themes that might help us to better understand what is going on. And if we think of the main contestations, but also main issues for our future, then I think work and labor is an extremely good example. And there's also a certain irony or tension because the liberal script is very closely tied to the capitalist order, and many of the problems that are related to work are in part produced by this very capitalist order. And I think this is something that the discussion will be around. I think the rest then will be done by our two main stars of this evening. And before I ask them to come up and I go down, let me thank, first of all, our two partners in crime for this event, the Suhrkamp publisher, as you all know, one of the main and most important publishers in Germany and beyond, with a very long tradition of critical interventions into all kinds of social, intellectual, historical, and economic problems. And of course, our host, Silent Green, which offers this very nice space, which is ideal for what we are having in mind. So welcome again, and as you will know, there will be also opportunity to ask questions and make comments, and just use the opportunity to do this. And now join me in a warm welcome applause to Rebecca Ritters, who will moderate Aaron, and to Aaron Benanav, who is presenting some ideas of his most recent book, which you can buy after this event over there. Thank you very much, and again, welcome.
Hello, welcome. Yes, it is a very bright light indeed. Thank you to Andreas Eckert for that lovely introduction. So yes, on behalf of Scripts, it has now been very well introduced by Andreas. I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome to this fourth discussion of Futuring the Liberal Script, Automation and the Future of Work. And with me is Aaron Benanov. My name's Rebecca Ritters. As Andreas said, I'm a news anchor and correspondent with Deutsche Welle News, which is Germany's foreign broadcaster. So I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation. But as you have been forewarned, Philip Stamm was supposed to be here asking the questions. So let's hope that automation doesn't take my job away in the future, or in fact that I don't ask the right questions. So without further ado, let's just get started, Aaron. I'd like to introduce, first of all, Aaron Benanov. He's I'm sure you must all know who he is, and that's why you're here, but I will do this anyway for the people at home. He's an economic historian and social theorist. He's currently doing a postdoctoral research and academic coordinator of the research unit Reallocation as a part of that cluster of excellence Scripts. Aaron's research interests include 19th... I did tell you it was going to be long, Aaron, sorry. Gives you a moment to open the water. Aaron's research interests include 19th and 20th century global economic history, economic development, labour market dynamics, unemployment and inequality. His first book, and which we'll be discussing tonight, is Automation and the Future of Work, and was published firstly in English in November last year, and has now been translated into German and can be found through that publisher, Suhrkamp, that Andreas mentioned, can be purchased here or bought online. So before joining Humboldt, Aaron was a Harper Schmidt Fellow in the Social Sciences at the University of Chicago, and he holds a PhD and MA in History from the University of California. So, shall we begin? So this conversation was going to be broken up into 5 sections. We're going to stick to that format, and we'll be discussing the topics as they go through. Actually, one thing that I do want to mention, I see everyone's wearing a mask. Anyone who feels comfortable to do so or would like to, I've been told we are allowed to take them off. So feel free, obviously not obligatory. And for anybody who wants to tweet anything that's said tonight, hopefully nothing by me, that you should do that using the hashtag Futuring the Liberal Script, and you can follow the account on Twitter at Scripts Berlin. So I don't see anybody getting out their phones, but maybe that's a good thing. All right, so first of all, can everybody hear okay? Yeah, okay. So first of all, we'll go through basically the theses of Aaron's book, and the first one is job-destroying automation is not accelerating, which I found an interesting concept. Do you want to talk us through a little bit what you mean by that, Aaron?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, when I was writing this book, I should say, the title of my kind of Word document was Automation and the Future of Work, because that was the topic that I was working on. And, you know, I guess this is true in journalism as much as in a lot of the writing I do. Often you don't get to choose your titles, actually. They're put on your articles for you. And so I just assumed that the publisher would eventually change the name of the work. But they thought this was a great title for the book, because it's a huge topic that everyone is interested in. And one of the funny things about the book is that a lot of people pick it up thinking the book is going to say, wow, we are living in this time of incredible technological change and acceleration of automation, that, you know, jobs are being lost right and left. There's a famous study that, you know, whenever I'm asked about the book, by journalists, they usually bring up this study that says 47% of jobs today are going to be automated in some period of time, usually not specified, but it seems like a huge issue. And the book, in a lot of ways, is actually a critical engagement with this automation literature. So it's really important to kind of have that in mind, and I'm sure people interested in the topic, interested in the book, will already know that there are just so many stories about this, stories in the news media, last year in the United States. We had Andrew Yang running a whole, trying to win the nomination for the Democratic Party on a kind of humanity first, let's deal with automation ticket. And so these are really big issues. And part of what I want to get at in the book, or what the book does, is it explains why these are such big issues. And it explains essentially what the automation theorists, or the automation discourse, as I call it, what they're trying to say about what's going on.
Why then, I mean, why are people, or the automation theorists, so worried about this? And perhaps you could go and explain what you spoke to me about backstage, that this figure of 47% of jobs being lost is actually a falsehood. And then, sorry, I'm guilty as charged as journalist, probably spouting that and spreading that fake news.
Well, I think, you know, it's a very contentious topic, and when that figure was released in 2013 in a working paper by these two researchers at Oxford, Frey and Osborne, it just immediately took off. Like, it wasn't even the official final published version. It was just a working paper they released, and it just went viral because it seemed to speak to something, right, that people really believed. Now, later studies of the automation, the job-destroying potentials of current technologies really significantly reduced that figure. And the reason is that in the original study, Frey and Osborne didn't distinguish between partial automation, like jobs that will be transformed in some significant way through new technologies, and jobs that will actually be destroyed through new technologies. So most of the later studies, and you know, my book kind of relates to this point, though it takes a slightly different angle on it, most of the studies say that only about 14% of jobs today are likely to disappear from automation.
Okay, that is a massive discrepancy.
Yeah.
Between 14 and 47. But I mean, why is it such a problem? I mean, maybe that seems really obvious, but perhaps we should break it down to that. Why are we getting these doomsday things about automation?
Yeah, so I think a big claim about the book is that the reason why people are so concerned about this is because there are real problems in our society, in the labor market. People are experiencing a lot of job insecurity. They're worried about their futures. They're worried about what will happen to them if they lose their jobs. And you know, today, I mean, we could talk about what's going on in the kind of, I don't know, transition maybe, hopefully, out of the COVID economy, because today we're looking at least in some fields, really big labor shortages, and we can talk about what's happening today. But why that's so surprising to people and why it's so upending society, especially in the US at the moment, is because for the past 40 or 50 years, the reality has been much the opposite, that there's been worsening problems of job insecurity, of, if not always, unemployment, really high underemployment, jobless recoveries, you know, the rising wealth of the 1% as everyone else is kind of seeing their income stagnate. Those are the kind of concerns that the automation theorists are trying to explain, and those concerns are very real. But the argument I'm making is that they are giving the wrong explanation.
Well, I was just going to, as you touched on the labor shortages that we're seeing at the moment, I thought I may as well pick up on that because that's something that I was interested in, although we discuss it as somewhat a separate issue. But we're talking about job losses through automation, and yet we're seeing nothing at the moment but labor shortages, it would seem. So perhaps you could discuss the discrepancy there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. Like in 2019, 2020, it just seemed like robots were going to take over all of the jobs, and everyone was worried. And you know, I would get asked questions like, if I want my child, you know, to have a job in 20 years, like what are the fields where they still will have a chance to have work? But instead, what we saw during COVID was, first of all, just a massive need for people to fill warehouse jobs, to work in nursing and in hospitals. Over the past year and a half, we've seen, you know, just really a lot of people, especially in healthcare, but also in all of these other essential jobs, being overworked and burned out by how much physical human labor has been required. And now, again, as the economy is trying to pull out, at least in certain parts of the economy, from the COVID crisis, we're seeing shortages. In the US, they're talking about it as the great resignation, because suddenly all of these workers who've had terrible jobs for a really long time feel entitled to just tell their bosses, I quit, I'm moving on, like this terrible job sucks and you can shove it. And that is, a really big turnaround. And I think what I want to talk about is sort of the longer context for why this is such a unique moment. It's important to remember that, way back in the so-called golden age of post-war growth, unemployment rates were just very low for a very long period of time. And the idea that workers, it was a job taker's economy where they could just tell their boss if they didn't like their job, I quit. That period in which unemployment was low ended a long time ago. And for the last 50 years, it really hasn't been like that. And I think as will come out in the course of the conversation, I believe, based on my research, that it's probably likely that the labor shortages we're seeing now and the inflation and the supply chain issues are actually pretty temporary phenomena, and that as we kind of pull out, if we do pull out, who knows exactly what's going to happen with COVID and the pandemic as it evolves. But if we do pull out of the crisis, I think we're going to see a return to those long-term trends, slow growth, job insecurity, and so on. Not that these labor shortages are actually going to continue. So it's a kind of pessimistic account in some ways about the inner potential for dynamism of the contemporary economy.
Okay, so then let's move to the second thesis of the book, which is, of course, then weak economic growth causes a low demand for labor. Why is that?
Essentially, so one of the big arguments of the book is why, if automation isn't really destroying so many jobs, and the book goes into some detail to try to explain how actually the degree to which jobs are being destroyed through technology in recent decades is much lower than it was in the past. There hasn't been an acceleration of job destruction. It's actually really slowed down in recent decades. So the question is, why is there all of this labor insecurity, jobless recoveries, increasing income inequality, and so on? And the book argues that it's really because economies the world over, not in every country. Obviously, China has experienced really rapid growth in the last 30 years, but especially in the West and really for the world as a whole, what we've seen is slowing economic growth. And I'll just say, on the one hand, that what this slowing economic growth does is it reduces the job creating potential of the economy. So a big claim of the book is it's not really that jobs are being destroyed at a faster pace than in the past, it's that jobs aren't being created as fast as they were in the past. And I think intuitively a lot of, to use the phrase very loosely, younger people, people under 40, they're not really so young, but people under 40 have lived through, in their working lives, they've seen two supposedly once-in-a-lifetime crises that really dramatically affected their job security, their lifetime earnings, their potential to find work. And that condition, especially affecting youth, high rates of youth unemployment, all of these things are related to the fact that economies are just slowing down. They are not generating as many new jobs as they did before. Economists call this secular stagnation. They have a bunch of different explanations for why it's going on. And part of the book is about bringing out those debates and also providing a different explanation for why these trends are taking place. That is to say, why is the economy slowing down and why isn't it providing as many new jobs as it used to?
But the big social things that we've discussed, which I'm assuming you mean the pandemic and the financial crisis that the under 40s have experienced, is also possibly having an effect on what they want to get out of life and perhaps not focus so much on career and job as we spoke about before in terms of changing the perspective on what's important in life. And therefore, perhaps that's a positive when we talk about automation and automation taking away some of the roles that people perhaps no longer want to do.
Yeah, I think, and I hope we'll get to talk about this more. What I really like about the automation theorists and the automation discourse is that it has a really positive, almost at times utopian account of what we should be aiming for as a society that says we should be aiming for a world with where people just feel fundamentally secure. You know, in their version of the story, people just wake up, you know, on the first day of every month, their bank account is just replenished by basic income. They don't have to worry about how they're going to survive, how they're going to pay their rent, how they're going to, you know, pay for any health accidents that have taken out, for example, one of our panelists today. You know, the idea that that we should try to get to a world where people feel this kind of fundamental and abiding security, and where their lives aren't so focused on their jobs, but they have this time and the resources to kind of build relationships. You know, even in a world of automation, people will still fall in love and out of love and have all kinds of, you know, human experiences that matter, building friendships, trusting people, you know, and all of this kind of stuff. Those ideas, I think, are really positive, and they point toward an idea of, a vision of the future for what humans should be fighting for. But a lot of the account I'm giving is to say, well, technology actually isn't getting us there. If we want to fight for a different world, we're going to have to fight for it through social change and political change rather than depending on technologies to do that work for us.
Which I think the pandemic clearly showed people's priorities changing, and yeah, exactly what you just said. Okay, so let's move on to when we talk about the third thesis, which is services, and a service economy can't replace manufacturing as a growth engine. So what are the effects of that? If manufacturing is waning, as we're seeing in many economies, perhaps not in Germany or China, but you know, in many other economies. So what are the effects of that, and what can we do to replace the waning manufacturing economy?
Yeah, so a big part of my story about why there's this long-term stagnation trend is that in the past, manufacturing and industry, we had industrial economies that really served as an engine of growth. And the whole post-war boom, in my account, was really, and this isn't really anything unique to me, was really based on the revival of export economies and export-led growth. And for decades, that generated incredible economic growth, especially in Germany, but also in many parts of the world. And starting in the 70s and 80s, that really started to run down. And, you know, one thing that I think is, well, what I argue in the book is that this is actually because so many countries now had developed industrial capacity and were competing to sell goods on the world market, that markets became increasingly overcrowded, and growth within those markets became harder to achieve. It became more of a kind of zero-sum game, where countries like, let's say, Germany or China, growing quickly, were now coming at the expense of growth in other countries. And one thing I point out that people often find surprising, because when they talk about deindustrialization, they usually think, well, all of these jobs that used to be done in countries like the United States, the UK, France, and so on, are now being done in poorer countries. But one surprising finding is that actually a lot of poorer countries are deindustrializing too. They're also seeing a decline in their manufacturing workforces. And so, and actually even China, which reindustrialized in the 2000s, has been deindustrializing since around 2013, and the world as a whole has seen this deindustrialization. So obviously that's something the automation theorists want to explain in terms of an acceleration of technological change in the industrial economy. And what the book shows is that actually it's because industry is just expanding much less quickly in this increasingly overcrowded global economy. So you have this waning or running down of the industrial growth engine. And then, as you said, a big part of the argument of the book is that, you know, we always hear this talk about, you know, the transition to a tertiary economy, the service economy. That's where most people work. Obviously, Germany, still a more industrial international powerhouse. And a very interesting kind of feature of that story is that actually countries like Germany and Japan that have done better in international markets and still have more manufacturing capacity are actually ahead of the curve in terms of automation. There's more automation in German factories because it helps them compete internationally, rather than automation being a source of job loss. Actually, the United States and the UK, which have seen dramatic deindustrialization, are way behind countries like Germany and Japan in bringing robots into the production process. So it's hard to explain those job losses simply as a result of technology. It's really, I'm saying, part of this global story of overcrowded manufacturing markets. But the other side, again, is just that services can't replace industry as a growth engine because services happen to be marked by this endemically low productivity growth. Technological change, labor-saving technological change, just happens much more slowly in services than it does in other parts of the economy. And in fact, the last decade, which was supposed to be the decade of incredible technological change, computerization, and so on, as it saw this continued transition into being a service economy, actually saw the lowest rates of labor-saving technological change of any decade going back to 1950. And the argument is sort of that this transition to low productivity growth services is swamping whatever technological changes we're seeing, are being swamped by this general tendency of the economy to move labor into these low productivity growth activities. And that's lowering the kind of long-term growth potential of these societies. And it's also why, in my view, it's very unlikely that the current COVID crunch and supply chain crunch is actually going to lead to a new boom, economic boom. It's much more likely, I think, that after a period of transition and multi-speed economy, that we're going to see kind of a return to this long-term trend of slower growth and an increasingly service-based economy.
So I'm not really sure whether to feel buoyed by your arguments, Aaron, because obviously automation, you're saying, is really having a positive effect on many economies and is in fact not as bad as the doomsayers say. But at the same time, of course, the weak economic growth is causing these issues that many people think are coming from automation. So then what is the answer? If services can't replace manufacturing, if we're not going to be able to build economies and grow economies at the same rate that we have done, is there a solution, or what do you hypothesize as a solution which will lead us to investment decisions need to be made democratically, which I think is, maybe it's not going to come up. But anyway, investment decisions need to be made democratically, and is whether or not this will help in terms of a solution to some of the problems we're discussing.
Great, yeah. So, you know, one of the big ideas in the automation in the field or the discourse where people are talking about automation, which I already mentioned, is this kind of idea that basic income can solve the problem. And we saw a little bit of that during the pandemic. And really, in the United States, for example, where Trump and Congress just handed out really big checks for $1,200 and then $2,400 to families, what we saw is that even though the United States had massive job loss, a lot of trouble getting people unemployment benefits, these just cash payouts reduced by a little bit the poverty rate in America. You know, and that was a really huge, that was a very positive thing in a lot of ways.
Something that I was quite surprised to see in US or North American policy, to be quite honest, but it has not an austerity measure, but a sort of a spending measure to kind of get out of, which seemed to have a very positive effect, or at least staved off some of the more disastrous effects of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, it's really, there's something very positive about the idea that, you know, the automation theorists they're saying, look, in their view, we're living through this age of incredible technological change. It's just getting rid of all of these jobs. And the real problem is just getting money into people's hands. In a lot of ways, what they're saying is the thing that stands between us and a better world is just to get over this liberal idea, in a sense, that people need to work in order to be responsible, right? The idea of basic income is like, we need to get over this work ethic and just give people money, And then they will be able to buy all of these amazing things that the robots are producing, and we can kind of get ourselves onto this highway towards a really different and better future. That's their idea. I'm saying that in reality, the automation account, they're not right. We don't live in a time of incredible, accelerating economic growth and technological capacities. In fact, what we've been seeing for 40 or 50 years, and the discourse is really just starting to change in the last year and a half of the COVID crisis, is that basically for a very long time, governments have been responding to slow growth by trying to create, as they say, better investment conditions, a better business climate. And what does that look like? It's looked like austerity measures to kind of squeeze public services. It's looked like reforms of the labor market, like Hart-Sphere, that are really about pushing people to take whatever jobs are available, to look more like the US labor market, where unemployment benefits are very weak and workers just have to find jobs that they can. And it's also looked kind of paradoxically to people who think of the current era as one of neoliberal reform. It's also been an era in which governments have actually taken on massive quantities of debt to try to stimulate the economy. Low interest rates, massive waves of government spending through crises, in order to kind of get the engine of growth going again. And what we've seen over the last 40 years is that that really hasn't played out. And so my view is that even if we had a basic income, which has certain benefits, the reduction of this obsession with the work ethic, the idea of unconditional sort of support, there are these positive aspects of it, but it won't overcome this longer term trend towards slower growth, towards pressures for austerity, and just generally the kind of things that are, are causing not just economic problems, but political polarization and so on.
But is that hampered by the fact that the spending, or the borrowing rather, wasn't actually then spent on modernization or on social programs or anything? It was actually, as you argue, spent on paying back investors and not really going back into the base of the economy. So perhaps the borrowing itself is not a problem. It's how that money is spent once it's borrowed.
Yeah, I think, one thing we're seeing during COVID in a lot of countries, maybe Germany is a partial exception here, was that there had just been, 40 years of disinvestment from the healthcare system, from all kinds of public services and public economy, that the COVID crisis really revealed the weakness, not only of the physical infrastructure, but the social infrastructures of these societies. And it really showed people, I think, to some extent, what really mattered. And it really revived in a very interesting way this idea that we can't just leave matters to the market, and freeing markets is not going to be the solution to making people happier. Even this recent, the issues that are happening now with supply chains around just-in-time economies, you see this kind of return of an interest in really in planning, though they don't like to talk about planning in the West, so they call it industrial policy. That's the polite term for it. And you see some, especially around the idea, many people are concerned that the COVID crisis was just a kind of the opening act of a much larger set of crises that are coming down the pipe now because of climate change. And the idea that society actually needs to do something. We need more planning, we need more active public control over the economy, over the process of social provisioning. I think that that's actually a really positive turn. And I think the best thing, the best thing about the response to COVID has been this idea, both from the population and from politics, that we need to invest more in just making people happier and improving the conditions of their lives. One of the big concerns that I raise in the book is that I also think we live in an era where people become very doubtful about the idea that experts and technocratic governments are going to actually do the things that have to be done to improve people's lives. There's a real issue of a need for much more democratic control over this process. And so, I mean, this is a very big topic, and in the book it only starts to touch on this idea that instead of having a financially driven and profit-driven kind of economy, we need to really have a much more democratic economy and a more democratic control over investment to kind of stop this trend where slower growth leads to austerity, leads to political and economic polarization and so on, that we're going to have to change things in a really significant way.
But a basic income would be a step towards that, would it not? To democratizing the economy?
Yeah, basic income could be part of it, for sure. But in a way, it doesn't get at the larger economic issue, which is whether or not there's going to be investment in the economy to produce the kinds of things that income could purchase.
And of course, who will pay for that basic income anyway? How will revenue be created?
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Order to... I suppose okay, there's the climate change thing, but when we talk about these crises, the COVID crisis, and that leads nicely towards that idea of abundance is a social relationship, and the concept that people during the crisis perhaps felt less attached or less worth from their jobs and their day-to-day, and perhaps going back to that hunter-gatherer concept of not working all the time, but actually investing in other parts of our lives that make us happy. So that brings us to the fifth thesis, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about that social relationship and what you mean by abundance of it.
Yeah, so one of the book is not really a book about like what we should do right now in the sense of like what how to get from here to there to a better economy, a better society. It's about, in a lot of ways, it's about that vision of where we're going. Like, where should we be aiming at? What is the kind of world that we want to live in? And in a lot of ways, I draw a lot of inspiration from the kinds of theories I'm criticizing, the theories of these automation, the automation discourse, because I like the idea that we should live in a world where people have this kind of fundamental and abiding security, where that sense of material and social security opens up their worlds and allows them to think about their lives. Like, what do they want to do with the time they have on Earth? Do they want to really work on their yoga practice? Do they want to meld their minds with machines and, I don't know, whatever kind of transhumanist ideas people have? Or, do they want to, like start a band or whatever it is, these kind of ideas about what gives our lives meaning beyond work. Those are the kind of ideas the automation theorists are thinking about that I think are really positive, that we should be thinking about as a society. But my argument is that technologies are actually not going to be the thing that gets us there. Waiting around for artificial intelligence is not going to be the way to create this different world where people feel this real sense of abundance and possibility in their lives. That getting there is going to require changing society, changing social relationships in a really significant way. And the argument of the book is that we can actually get to that place of abundance even in a sustainable way, even facing the climate crisis. We can still create a world where people feel this fundamental sense of security that has this kind of world-opening effect and allows them to think beyond their work. But the argument of the book is that we're not going to get there simply by depending on technology to abolish our work. We're going to have to reorganize and redistribute the work that has to be done. We're going to have to think about reorganizing the way we deal with labor and creating a world, the world that we live in now, where you have this, in the US, great resignation, where all these people are quitting jobs. That's because the jobs they have are just terrible. They have so little control over their lives. Right now on the internet, people are sharing all of these, I don't know if you've seen these texts that are really amazing and unique, I think, in US history, where, people are working these jobs where they are constantly on call to take shifts, at a bar, for example.
But not getting paid to be on call, I'm assuming.
Yeah, exactly, right? Just, you know, with very short notice being told they have to come in and cover for someone. And people are just telling their bosses, like, no, I can't live like this. I just can't live in a world where I'm constantly on call and it's ruining my life. And then their bosses yell at them and they just quit their jobs. And that feeling of just being able to say no, you know, and feel secure is something that Americans have not felt for so long.
America is the only place that I would have been fired. This is a bit of a personal story and kind of a little bit off topic, but on that, I mean, I was there at the height of the financial crisis, having a waitressing job, desperately trying to do something that was going to further my career and better my situation, and I wanted to do one day. So anyway, I tell my boss, and he literally fired me on the spot. And that is the situation I feel in America in the job market, or at least it was in post-2008. I was there in 2009. A small personal anecdote, but I think that's something that many Americans experience, and I don't think that is the experience here or in other places, even in Australia from where I'm from, but that seems to be something that's changing with the labour shortage that's going on, as you say, and people taking back the power in a way.
Yeah, and I think that exactly is something that would have to happen on a much larger scale, and especially if we're not going to be able to use technology to get rid of work, then reorganizing work and giving people a lot more control and say over their work and making it possible for people to both work less and feel like their work is more meaningful can create the conditions where we can actually provide the goods and services that people need to feel secure and have this kind of create abundance as a social relationship in a sustainable way, create a world where people feel this fundamental security that allows them to really open up their worlds and think more broadly about what they want to do with their lives. And I'm sure that, you know, my experience in Germany, a country I've only lived in, you know, for a year and change, is that especially a lot of young people feel the same kinds of pressures to a lesser extent than in the US, but a similar sense that they're so worried about how they're going to make a living, that it has this effect of like reducing your ability to think about your future and your life and what you want for your life. And I think that that's really important. I think the idea that that's due simply to automation and robots taking jobs turns out to be inaccurate, but there's something really important about that feeling that we should build a world where we have that security and where our worlds do open up, and that is something that we can achieve. It's something that would be very hard to achieve because of the way the economy is organized, because of political polarization and so on, but I think that's something that's really, to me, amazing about living through the last 10 years is that there has been this attempt to, or this feeling that we should recover a positive sense of the future, that we should actually fight to create the world that we want to see, because the world that we're getting, especially not just with the crises we've experienced, but also climate change coming down the road, it just feels very unlikely that we're going to get that better world handed to us, as it were, automatically.
It certainly sounds utopian, and I'm feeling more hopeful than I was when I was asked to do this chat when we talk about automation. But just something I don't want to get too off topic, but this all sounds wonderful. How does it play out in terms of the developing world? Is that something that can be extrapolated, or are we simply talking about the Western world, if you want, or the developed world?
So the book is actually not primarily about the developed world. It's actually a global account, and it really says a lot about the global South or non-Western countries, because that's actually a lot of what I study in my more academic work. I'm a historian of unemployment and of global development. And part of why I wrote, I mean, my original interest in the topic is just because in the world as a whole, we've been having this problem of a lack of jobs and of the massive expansion of the informal economy. I mean, in the world as a whole, only about a quarter of the population, a quarter of the global labor force has any kind of permanent work at all. Most people are either in temporary jobs or they are working without contracts, just day laborers and so on, or they're working in this massive informal economy of small family operations. And that world that's been around for a very long time, actually, in countries like India, Kenya, Brazil, Mexico, that economy is just not, the fact that so many people need work in the world is just simply not due to automation stealing their jobs. There's actually more of a role for those technologies there because the industrialization of agriculture has actually played a very big role in destroying a lot of jobs in the rural economy. But in the world, we have this massive problem of a lack of jobs, and it's very clear, especially from that global perspective, that it's the lack of growth. It's really this big crisis in the early 80s, the third world debt crisis, and the kind of end of the development era and the slowing down of the world economy really constrained the conditions for growth in the global south. And it just meant that there's really, in many countries, there's been a kind of permanent jobs crisis unfolding for decades. And so, yeah, the book actually, one of the things I try to do in the book is to really connect up trends happening in richer Western countries with trends happening in the global south. And again, to point out that so many people just simply imagine, and it seems very obvious, that jobs are just moving from rich countries to poor countries, and that, if we're suffering deindustrialization here, it must be because the rest of the world is industrializing, and confronting people at the fact that Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, these countries have been deindustrializing now for almost 40 years, actually. And even China, which was industrializing very quickly, has also been deindustrializing now for about 8 years, and India as well. So the book is really trying to provide a very global account of these phenomena. So check it out. I mean, I focus on the first world stuff here because, I think when people think about automation and job loss, it's a very, local kind of question, but the book tries to think globally about it.
Excellent. Well, we're going to continue talking, of course, but I wanted to invite people to slowly think about any questions that you might have for Aaron. And we have one already come in, and I wanted to touch on this, so it's good that it's come in via YouTube, and that is, how can we experience abundance in the climate crisis when resources are becoming more scarce?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial question. And, what I would say is that I've been very interested in how the conversation about the climate crisis has evolved and what kinds of changes people think are going to be necessary in order to solve the problem. Like, do you think that we're going to solve the climate crisis without really affecting most people's everyday life? Is it just a matter of changing our infrastructure and how we make steel and how we produce energy, and it won't really affect most people? Or do you believe that it will require changes in people's lives, and it really will require reorganizing a lot of the economy, and that that means dislocation, that means sacrifice, and that means that average everyday people are going to have to be really involved in the process of adjusting to a more sustainable world? I believe that the second camp is much more right, that this is going to require really involvement of average everyday people in changing their lives. And when you think about that,
not only average everyday people, I hope, in terms of the inequalities there. It can't just be everybody, everyday people that are changing when the bigger structures are not changing.
Exactly. And the movement in France, the Gilets jaunes, really spoke to that, right? Just imposing change on poor people living in the periphery of cities with these diesel taxes created this massive social response. So what I want to say about that is that, actually providing people with this deep sense of security that's not linked to work, telling everyone, like, we are going to make sure that as this crisis happens, which, mind you, is inevitably going to involve massive migration from the tropics to the more temperate zones, like huge changes in the distribution of populations. Sea level rises are going to inundate coastal areas, just based on what's already baked in to the climate. And there's going to be really big changes, and we're only going to get through that, I think, as a society. I mean, there's very dark versions of what that could look like. I think any positive vision you have has to be based on this idea that we are going to change the way our society works to give people this basic security in their lives, that they're going to be okay and that we're going to make these changes in the way we live together. So for me, it's very important that, and I hear, I rely on a number of really interesting theorists from psychologists, as well as a much longer kind of what I call post-scarcity tradition, to say that abundance isn't, we've been lied to think that abundance should only be thought of in terms of a cornucopia, like abundance is the experience of, lakes of honey and machines like in the Jetsons that drive you around everywhere. I'm saying that abundance is really an experience people have of this fundamental and abiding security that opens up their world and makes them feel like so much is possible. And there have been a whole trend in psychology to really bring out this idea that scarcity and abundance shouldn't be thought of merely as being about like the provision of an infinite number of goods and services, but really about this deep and abiding world-opening security. And that's the kind of abundance that I think we can provide, even in a sustainable way, and that we have to provide in order to really change the way we organize our society to deal with the climate crisis.
All right, I have another question coming in for you, and it touches on the section number 4, the thesis 4, investment decisions need to be made democratically. And the question is, how can we imagine a democratic economy? Sorry.
A brief water break. Yeah, I think that's a really important question because we have all of the examples of the failures of attempts to radically change the economy in the 20th century, and those are things that we should really take seriously. We have the examples of the failures of central planning, which obviously wasn't a democratic economy. It was very much run from the center, very top-down, very little involvement of average everyday people in decision-making. And we also have the example of the failures of a more interventionist economy in the West in the 60s. I think people are too quick to forget that the same people who were trying to run the economy as Keynesians from Washington, they were the same people who decided to hire a guy from Ford Motor Company to prosecute the Vietnam War as if it were just a kind of technical question of defeating communists with the body count. So I think that the examples we have from the past of an interventionist economy in the 20th century or a more or a different kind of economy, those models won't work for us anymore. And so I'm very interested in the idea of building a different kind of economy that is more democratic. And I guess that, look, I'm not going to be able to go through that in any real detail here, but what I would say is that instead of imagining that these new information and communication technologies could be used to automate all decisions for us and take political questions out of people's hands and just have an automatic economy, we can actually imagine using these technologies not in the way that they're used on places like Facebook and Twitter, which seem to really amplify conflicts, and we know that that's because of the way their algorithms are designed and the kinds of involvement that they're looking for. We could build a different kind of information and communication infrastructure that would actually allow more people to participate in making the big decisions that affect their lives. But how to do that, I think, is a big open question. And I have some ideas about it, but I think it's a much broader research project, and I actually think a lot of people are trying to figure that out right now, and that it's a very exciting avenue of research today.
Okay, then how do we deal with then economic and political elites that still promote inequalities and an only profit economy?
I mean, that's, I think, the big question is like, it's kind of amazing to me, when I started working on these questions like 15 years ago, and I was studying in the US, like wage stagnation and job insecurity and so on, and rising inequality, it felt like no one was talking about that. It was something that a few researchers were thinking about. 15, 16 years later, it is just the huge political issue that, we all, more and more people seem to recognize that we live in a world where increasingly few people are involved in making decisions, where politicians are increasingly insulated from their constituencies, and economic decisions are being taken by management. Anyone who's in the university sectors really experience this in a significant way. Faculty losing control and decisions being really made at the top. At least in America, it's been a very bad problem. So somehow simultaneously, we're experiencing more public concern with issues of inequality, and at the same time, nothing seems to be changing that. The problem just gets worse. And so I think that this is going to just be the really big issue, and I believe that the only thing that's going to create change in the end is really big pressure from below, that's got to be an essential part of the story. And a lot of what gives me hope is that over the past 10 years of growing interest in inequality and awareness of it, we've also just seen really big social movements arising, confronting austerity, confronting corrupt and technocratic governments, and that kind of renewed energy and kind of social struggle, that's really something that I draw a lot of hope from, because I don't think that these kind of systems are going to change themselves. I think that it's going to require big mobilization to change it.
But do you think we've seen outcomes from this groundswell of protests, as you say, and what's been happening? I mean, is it really affecting change at a policy level, do you think?
I think that's a really interesting question. Like, I would say that in spite of the hope that I get from,
it sounds utopian, and I hope so too.
Well, I even during the pandemic in the United States, the George Floyd rebellion during the pandemic was like the largest social movement probably in US history in terms of participation and reach and involvement. And then the movement died out, and people said, look, what does this change? And when Biden won the nomination and then became president, I thought, obviously he's just going to run his campaign from the center. We're not going to see any of the effects of any of these movements on politics. But at least I think that, Biden really surprised me. I'm not someone who's saying he's going to solve the problems, but what I mean to point out is that I actually think that the political conversation is changing, and there are people who are, if not, I think that in a lot of ways they're actually not so scared of the social movements. They're way more scared of the rise of the right than they are of the movements in the street. But in general, I think we are seeing more responsiveness at a discursive level to these kinds of concerns and to the street protests, but we're not really yet seeing dramatic change in how society works. And I think that just means that we're going to see more social movements and calls for change on a bigger level. I mean, I'm very interested locally to see what happens with the expropriation referendum, right, in Berlin, which won by a pretty big margin because people are so concerned about it. And my understanding is that the government is saying that we will elect a technical expertise group, which will provide a kind of, in 1 year, a kind of judgment about whether this is possible, which I think doesn't speak at all to the kind of the concerns, right, that led to so many people to support the referendum. So it seems to me very likely
that... Well, there's a lack of immediacy there, I suppose, so people... What was it all for, really? It's going to take so long. I just wanted to throw it out to the audience. Does anybody here have a question for Aaron? I can't see you very well. We have a microphone. Oh, there we go. Everyone's putting their mask back on and hiding. But if anyone has a question, otherwise we'll just keep talking. Oh, here we over here.
Yeah, thanks very much to both of you for the interesting discussion. And regarding being fired in the US, don't worry about it. It's a badge of honor.
I got over it, but
You're in good company. My question's for Aaron about political organization in the more automated times. I mean, as you're saying, the process really has to start from below. And a traditional avenue of that process is through workers' organization on the factory floor, in the restaurant, in the office, in the warehouse, and so forth. But how does that happen when workers are more compartmentalized and increasingly subject to, at least in certain industries, to processes that are almost entirely run through machines where workers don't have contact with each other? How can working class organization occur under these conditions of increased automation? Thank you.
Well, obviously, part of the story I'm telling is about how, although there is a lot of technological change and technologies being implemented in work, it's producing less automation than the kind of headlines would tell you. And maybe that's part of why, as we speak, we're actually seeing, in the context of this, labor shortage, and really in the US, the thing that's been so surprising to a lot of people is just that there are so many people who stopped looking for work during the pandemic who have just not returned to the labor market in the kind of partial recovery, probably because they, by a lot of reports, they're just fed up with the kinds of jobs that the economy is offering. And in this context, we've seen this big building strike wave, and it's really, we're now waiting to see how much it spreads. But in the US, there actually is right now, as we're speaking, a real kind of a big movement in the...
I don't want to get you off topic, but how? How are they surviving? Because there is no safety net basically in the US, and without basic income, how are they just simply not going back to work?
I guess that I should say that I think economists are really flummoxed by this. There's a real question there about how it is that people are surviving. But my basic sense is that during the pandemic, it's now been so long, and I think people have essentially either moved home or they've found ways to survive. They've kind of built networks for survival that really didn't exist before, and then actually are providing them with some basis to refuse to re-enter the labor market that wasn't there before. It's a really, to me, I think, a really surprising turn of events. And we'll just have to see how it plays out. It's also important to remember that in the US, so many people were sick and so many people died. I mean, a very large percentage of all of the COVID cases were happening there, and that presumably could have an effect as well. But in any case, you are seeing this big labor movement happening right now, and we'll just see where it goes. I think that, I guess my view is that I think that in the future, we'll see a combination of labor movements as well as movements that are rising from other areas of society around rent, around if austerity returns, around climate change, and that it's just going to look like a much more, it's going to look like a movement for change that is much more internally diverse and internally contentious than perhaps the kind of forms that these movements took in the 20th century. I'm not a strategic thinker. I just think that, all that I say is that people should look around and get involved in what's happening and figure out for themselves, what they think could be a possible avenue for change. I know that's not where my strong suit is, so.
Having said that, what am I trying to say? How can we do this on a policy level? What should politicians be doing to implement? What should they be implementing in order to bring about some of these changes? What would you recommend on a policy level?
Well,
I know you said you want strategy. Sorry to put you on the spot, but it's kind
I'm not really very good as a policymaker either. I think that I think that I would just say that the thing that's been positive to me in the current moment, so much of what's happened in the past year and a half has really shown like how poorly the response to COVID went, I think, in a lot of ways. Really, to me, it revealed a lot of a kind of deeper set of political fractures and political kind of stasis, I guess. But I think that the one aspect that was positive that came out of the crisis was a little bit of a sense of this idea that we should now focus, as I said, on like improving people's lives directly, whatever that would look like, whether it's sending them money, whether it's recognizing like a massive long-term disinvestment in schools and hospitals and other kinds of public services. And I think that idea that, some people are talking about this line from John Maynard Keynes, the kind of, economist who everyone says, was wrong, except when a crisis happens, and then suddenly on the front page of The Economist and the Financial Times, you see the return of Keynes. And in this moment, there's this line from him that people have been bandying about, that anything that we can actually do, we can afford. That in a sense, we should be less concerned with financial constraints and more concerned with just directly finding ways to improve people's lives. And I think that is something coming both from the population, from policy, from social movements, that I think that idea of a more human-centered economy, a human-centered society, that's something that I think, especially facing the climate crisis, we're just going to have to see a lot more of.
Which sounds fantastic. It's hard to argue against that, but simply how do economies afford it? I mean, he says that we will just be able to afford it, but how? Where does the money actually come from? How can we do it, especially when we're faced with economies that are struggling under the weight of the COVID crisis and, the climate crisis?
I know.
Impending climate crisis.
That's a great question, and I don't have enough of. I guess those are really difficult economic problems to explain in a way. And I think the issue of communicating them to a popular audience is something that's really, really difficult. But it is actually true that even in a capitalist economy, when there is investment, it creates the financial resources that make that possible. And that's actually how the whole economy works. Like banks don't just wait to get money and then lend it out. They lend money that they don't have. They create money. And the whole economy is actually based on the whole economy works on principles that are not the principles of a household. And that's something that is very difficult to explain. And it's kind of but it is actually true that if we have people without work and machines that aren't being used, we can just make things, and actually a lot of the kind of financial questions work themselves out. But it in a way, these are much more political questions than economic ones. Yeah.
I still fail to understand how that happens in the developing world, though. Is that not a utopian concept to expect that this? I mean, it seems like it's difficult enough for it to happen in the West, maybe more difficult, I don't know. But in the developing world, it seems almost impossible.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's the kinds of changes that we have to make in society are only going to be possible with a much more globally coordinated project. I mean, to respond to climate change, to kind of, reinvest or recreate or transform the economy to be more human-centered. There really are, as you're saying, these kinds of deep constraints on what's possible that could only be solved through global coordination. So yeah, that's definitely true.
Now I'm just noticing the time. We're going to have to wrap up soon. So I just wanted to open this up again to the audience. We have a question over here. For our online audience.
I know that you looked into the numbers a lot, and I wondered if you could speak about the differences in different world regions and their dependence on manufacturing and maybe service economy, because if we see this big change, maybe some world regions will change more than others. And thinking of, for example, China, where manufacturing is very big, how are they going to create, a democratic, more democratic work world in a utopian world?
That's a really interesting question because, and here actually I've been really surprised again by, I guess it's funny, I'm a real optimist about, some, or even have these kind of utopian dimensions to my thinking where I'm really excited to talk about what should our vision for the world be, but I'm really pessimistic about what kind of changes governments would actually make, to move in that direction at all in the present world. And one thing that's been really surprising about what's going on in China right now is that they are much more aware in the government of the kinds of deep problems they face in a world where really over the long term, their manufacturing economy is slowing down, it's not growing as fast. The potential for them to kind of revive their export-led growth model is really reducing. And actually, one of the biggest sources of growth in China has not been manufacturing, but construction, and just building all of these, local governments selling land, building giant housing projects that ultimately are not being used for people to live in, but are being purchased as like speculative or investment vehicles, basically, financially. And they just are allowing that one of the largest players in this world to collapse or to go bankrupt and at least be restructured. And they're promoting this idea of common prosperity, that there has to be all of this wealth taken from the rich and just kind of redistributed. And that is their attempt to kind of internally rebalance their economy and prepare for this slowdown. And in a lot of ways, I think the truth is that the world is just going to probably look a lot more turbulent, and it's going to really mean that whole process is just going to play out more chaotically than, and I think that actually part of why the Chinese government has been sort of asserting a much more centralized and authoritarian political control, even within the party itself, is because they recognize that the potential for turbulence and conflict is going to be very strong in this transition. But, I think even there, you're just seeing, you're seeing these issues enter not just public consciousness and social consciousness, but even politically, people are aware of it. Now, what that will look like if we're looking towards a kind of, future where something more positive in a more lasting way would take place, I think that there's no way to have a world where one country is like the workshop of the world and things are just sent around on ships everywhere. I mean, that's already something that the COVID crisis has made pretty clear. And so we're just going to have to imagine that a lot of that capacity is going to be redistributed, right? And that people are going to, as they already are in China, are going to move out of those kinds of really harsh factory jobs and move into other kinds of work. And that, there as here as everywhere, there's going to have to be a lot more attention to also reproductive work, right? Child care, health care, elder care, and that these are the kinds of jobs where these are really meaningful and important aspects of our society that are really underserved and where a lot of people ultimately, even in a capitalist economy, everywhere in the world are going to find work in the future. But there's ways of making that work actually really good and meaningful and giving people a lot of control over what that looks like. And then there's really, there's ways it can look a lot worse. So, yeah.
In every answer, Aaron, I go from the highs to lows. It's a very turbulent discussion. We have time for one more question. And Andreas?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to bring in one other aspect you did not really mention, although you referred to the George Floyd thing, and that is race. And of course, there's an increasing debate about racialized capitalism and how that factors in very much. And I was just wondering how this factors into your interpretation of the world and to what extent that might also then very much shape all visions we have of the future. Because, I mean, you always said we have to do this and we have to do that, but I was just wondering who is part of the we and who might feel excluded from the we making plans for the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think that the George Floyd movement was really, it was a movement for dignity for people who are just being treated like they aren't human and that they aren't worth, their lives don't matter. That's obviously the slogan, Black Lives Matter. But it's also a real, I think that, in the repetition of the slogan, sometimes what's lost is the real meaning of a world where there's so many people who just feel fundamentally like they have no dignity in society, and not just at a kind of political or social level, but also economically, that they are kind of the last to be served, and not just individually in a consumer way, but whole communities that are kind of left aside. And that's true globally as well. I mean, we've seen that with the vaccines, right? That, we have a world where we actually, everybody knows that getting through this means preventing the emergence of new vaccine-evading variants, and that would require trying to really vaccinate the whole world. And yet we've just seen that, people here in Europe and in the US are talking about, oh, we're recovering from COVID, even though in the world is very far from that. And a lot of the stimulus money that's been spent has been so focused on certain communities and certain states, it hasn't actually been a global stimulus. So I think that problem of a lack of dignity, of a lot of the explosive social movements we've seen, not just in the US, but in many places in the world, emerging around police killings and the sense of a kind of lack of dignity, I think that is just incredibly important. And I also think it's important that the George Floyd movement, it wasn't, one thing that people say about it that I think is really important is that in the 60s, the civil rights movement really was, in a lot of ways, a Black movement with some ally participation. And one of the things that's fascinating about George Floyd is how multiracial it was in the US and how many people actually care about this, and these struggles really resonated with them. And I think that those kind of struggles for dignity, especially as they are inflected both by racial divisions and global divisions, that is just going to be a huge part of what happens in the future. It also really speaks to this idea that we're not going to achieve, that our vision of the future can't be one that depends on the idea that experts are going to be able to define and speak to the suffering and concerns of populations. Because what we see time and again is that actually the people who are suffering really need to have the space to speak for themselves and fight for the things that matter to them. And I think that the George Floyd Rebellion is a really important example of that need to kind of broaden participation and create civic spaces where people who are downtrodden can organize themselves and really fight for their dignity, and creating a world that in general is much more supportive of a dignified life, which I think, again, I think that the COVID crisis and the responses to the climate crisis suggest that this world generally isn't up to that task.
I have to say, Aaron, when I was asked to come and take part in a discussion about automation and the workforce, I did not think we would be getting to these sort of these topics, and I'm really touched and really appreciate the discussion today. Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, I believe. We're going to be cut out. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this wonderful discussion and for the wonderful work.
Thank you so much for filling in for Philip Stab and just, really, showing that, human beings still have something against the machines, right?
Yeah. Uplifting discussion, although sort of depressing in parts, but anyway. So thanks on behalf of Scripts. We'd like to thank you all so much for coming and participating in this discussion this evening. I've been asked not to forget that we have 2 more Script events coming up. They're both in German, so for the German speakers. One in November, actually they're both in November, one on the 5th and one on the 8th. We've got the dance floor is a political space, which does sound like a lot of fun. And how not to increase vaccination willingness. There's a bit of a play on words there, I think you'll find. So there's more info for both of those discussions on the website. Please do come along, but they are in German. And of course, do not forget to buy the wonderful work that we've been speaking about this evening. We have it for sale, I believe only in German here behind you. It can also be bought in both German and English online, of course. So please do.
Can I also say thanks not just to you for being an amazing interlocutor, also thanks to Scripps for hosting this, and thanks to Silent Green for making the space. And I also want to say a special thanks to Felix Kurz over here, who translated the book into German and really made this possible. So yeah, I'm really appreciative of the people who came out and the people who are watching online. I'm really excited, especially since I've made Germany my home for a while, to be able to share my work in German, even if at the moment I'm not yet capable of having this kind of discussion.
I've been here for 6.5 years and I'm not capable either. Thanks to Andreas Eckert for the wonderful warm welcome. So please do stay with us. Aaron will be outside, as will all the Scripps folk that are here, to share a glass of wine with you and continue the discussion. Do come again. Thank you very much.